Now, magic realism is one such literary trend that has witnessed, that has somehow enjoyed the maximum of this literary stardom. At the same time, it has received the worst of its kind of criticism. Criticism, it has been labeled as nothing more than a potpourri of fantastic elements brought together, a kind of a commercialized kitsch, a typical of a Latin American phenomena, exorcist in nature, or a kind of an escapist literature, a handy tool at the hands of these post-call writers, post-colonial writers, with a bid to write back. Salman Rushdie, when he says that the empire writes back, and the very act of writing back is nothing but contributing to the idea of decolonization. And the most handy tool, literary, say, trend or literary form that comes to a post-call writer could be, say, magic realism. Think of different numbers of works that Salman Rushdie has employed using magic realism as a tool. So this term, in fact, this literary trend, this current, was more that started off post, say, 1920s, post 1925, and it is in a way a kind of digression if we take into our account altogether realism. Next offshoot event, next natural occurrence of realism in literature would be naturalism. Next natural occurrence of naturalism would be, say, of course, here, of course, it is shown to be the decadent one. So magic realism was certainly, again, an offshoot of realism, but this is something that, in terms of its literary periodization and as a continuum to realism and naturalism, it appeared quite late. And that too, post-symbolism, post the idea of when impressionistic art or symbolism in general was forming the, was making a movement in arts and literature generally. And that is how we find that magic realism. In fact, the very demarcation from surrealism is something, had been a challenging one, which of course eventually we'll see. So as an offshoot of realism, this current was a fusion of fact and fantasy, which was meant to question the very nature of reality as well as call attention to the act of creation. So magic realism, why these two almost say disparate words being brought together, magic and realism? What's so magical about realism? And quite contrary, these words appear to be, say, oxymoronic in nature. But the idea is, in fiction and writing, when the literary artist was able to fuse together the narratives from the atmosphere of the outside, as well as picking up some of the fantastical elements from the folklore, from the indigenous cultural background, from the, if not mythology, but certainly stories of the past, the cultural beliefs, the geography, the history of a particular region, then the very blend, the very harmonious blend of realism and the fantastical element gave rise to this magical realism. Now, again, in order to understand magical realism, it's very important that we get a thorough understanding of, a thorough idea about symbolism, the various aesthetic movements that took place post 1920s, because this was more like the very term, in fact, it was employed in 1925. And if you see a number of years that has gone by, there's a huge gap when naturalism finally started to get discarded, or the demand for more avant-gardist forms started to appear, or the demand for symbolic way of representing work started to appear. This was quite a huge difference between them. There remains quite a number of years between these two. The transition is not that smooth. And going by when it appeared, this term, magical realism, was first introduced by Rowe, a German art critic, in 1925, who considered magical realism as an art category. To him, it was a way of representing and responding to reality and pictorially depicting the enigmas of. So we'll see that there is nothing more or less realistic in magic realism. It's just that it is mainly realism, but with an aid of certain magical elements, with an aid of certain additional planes of reality that existed, which are possible, but not always realistic in that manner. So magic realism, or realismo magico, it was also known as, was not something which will take into account every element of being marvelous or every element of fantastical in nature in the sense of fantasy. And that's how it's even different from fantastic literature as well. It was rather everything that happened in the story, in that very realistic story, happened within realm of reality using certain fantastical occurrences that were taking place not in reality. So this is where, as a literary mode or a style rather than as a standalone distinguished genre or a trend, this was appearing, and it ran on that very paradoxical nature of its existence. That is, reality and fantasy fused together, blended together, harmonious. So one was based on so-called rational view of reality, the other one based on the acceptance of supernatural as prosaic reality. So this is how, if you see the different literary trends and how they discard the previously optimized literary trend or previously optimized form of a particular age in the background, or previously somehow demands that newer forms, innovative forms come up, and with that innovative form, reality could be engaged with, the very existence, the very notion of existence can be engaged with, and in a bid to understand that complexity, the demand for these new innovations started coming up. And as I said, that magic realism is something which needs to be seen within the broader framework of, within the broader apparatus of symbolism, or the various offshoot movements of aestheticism. That is how, say, in fact, for example, surrealism, different from surrealism as well, but somehow very much in alignment with symbolism, impressionistic art, and surrealism as well. So, art critic Franz Roh, he applied this term magic realism to visual art initially in 1925, and he was designated just a style of visual art that brings extreme realism to the understanding of mundane subject matter, therefore revealing an interior mystery rather than imposing an external mystery. And this can be better explained in Roh's own words. We are offered a new style that is thoroughly of this world that we celebrate, and this world of objects is still alien to the current idea of realism. It employs various techniques that endow all things with a deeper meaning and reveal mysteries that always threaten the secure tranquility of simple and ingenuous things. It is a question of representation before our eyes in an intuitive way, the fact that the interior figure exists with respect of the exterior world. So as a label, just this was also a part of criticism against magic realism, that it was primarily being employed by Latin American novelists, and the label was first used, magic realism as a label was first used to describe the worldly and metaphysical fantasy of writers such as Jorge Luis Borges and the European Franz Kafka. Think of Kafka's Metamorphosis, a beautiful novel which talks about the character's sudden transformation into an insect, and how this sudden transformation, this sudden metamorphosis brings out the environmental factors. At the same time, of course, how can that happen that a human being is converted into an insect? But by use of that magic realism, a lot of this great deal of criticism of the social life, of the very relationship among human beings, the very kinship relationships were tended to be questioned. So then, of course, it is said that the works of Colombian novelists, think of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the best, probably the best popular voice of magic realism, and who can forget his 100 Years of Solitude and a couple of other works which were quintessential to the understanding of magic realism. Fiction that integrated elements of fantasy and other realistic settings. Tools used by magic realist authors, they would use hybridity, they would use the different planes of realism, there would be absolute use of transcendentalism. Transcendentalism, not in the sense how Emerson used it, transcendental world, characters making a journey to it, but somehow these omens, these the kind of premonitions coming out from these different worlds, the metaphysical worlds, out of which the veracity of which can be questioned very easily. Still, these premonitions working in the realistic background, the realistic narrations. Then authorial reticence, use of irony. So these fantastical fantastical qualities of this style of writing were heavily influenced by the surrealists. As I said, that in order to understand magic realism in its probably in its inclusion, it's important to look at its broader apparatus, that is, apparatus of different movements of aestheticism, and of course, it includes symbolism, say impressionism as well. The surrealist movement in Europe of the 1920s and the literary avant-gardism, as well as the exotic natural surroundings, native and exile culture. So this ultimately, as one of the critics have called it, as a potpourri of different fantastical elements operating within the realistic times. This was certainly a potpourri, but a potpourri of exile cultures, native land, which can absolutely be used to condemn, to criticize the very the exploits of these institutions, which otherwise maybe realism has or naturalism has failed to address. Right? And of course, keeping in mind not just the criticism of these institutions, even a simple feudal belief against women, against a particular class of society on the class spectrum, magic realism came as a handy tool. Some of the writers of the magic realism, Miguel Angel Astros, then Jorge Luis Borges, then Alizo Carpentier, then Laura Esquivel, then Gabriel Garcia Marquez, then Limitations and Critique. Though as an appendage of realism, it has been criticized for its very epistemology, for being mischievously distant from reality, but and of course, it certainly transgresses the boundaries, whether the boundaries are ontological, political, geographical, or generic in nature, but its very form has also been well used to account for the social protest against the oppressive governments, imperial governments. Think of, any, for that matter, most of the novels by Salman Rushdie. Feudal powers through the use of history and myth, supernatural events, folklore tropes as an antidote to narratives of the progress and rationality. So it's just that when a society undergoes a lot of historical changes, the complexities cannot just be addressed by way of the available forms that has been existing previously. For this, innovations and the demands to bring in or think of newer forms, the novelty of forms in itself becomes a challenge, and this is where the birth of new trends, new forms that comes in, that probably somehow address the the anxieties, the complexities of the times appropriately.